My name's Veronica Hope Hailey. I'm Professor of Strategic HRM at CAS, and my subject is going to be developing context-sensitive approaches to change. One of the reasons that I feel very passionate about this subject is that I believe that change can only be successfully implemented if it is designed in such a way that fits the organisational context of this particular company or public sector organisation that it's concerned with. And that's what I'm going to talk about over the next 40 minutes. For any of you that are interested in gaining further information about these ideas, we do publish a book, Exploring Strategic Change, written by myself and my colleague Julia Ballaghan, and the third edition is available, and what I'm going to talk about now is covered in part in that particular book. If you think about strategic change as a process, the first part of strategic change is the why and what, where you're trying to move the organisation to and for what reason. What are the competitive pressures in the marketplace that are making you actually move towards a new future state? So that's the why and what of change. What we're concerned about this afternoon is in fact the how. How do you actually make change happen? And if you look at this flow chart, the piece that we're particularly focusing on over the next 40 minutes is the analysis of the change context, the critical change features in any organisation that will act as drivers or barriers to change. And that's what we're going to really think about over the next few minutes. We've researched change now for nearly 20 years. And one of the things that fascinates us is the fact that when we look at how organisations design change, very often the greatest influence on how the change is rolled out is not the needs of the organisation, but the actual preferred approach of the change agent or the change leader and their particular leadership style. That actually starts to inform the judgment about the design of change far more, in fact, than the actual needs of the organisational context. What we're trying to suggest is that the change context itself, the context of the organisation, its receptivity to change, its peculiar features, are the things that anyone should concentrate on in the first instance before they actually design the change, so that they can make something that's fit for purpose. The tool that we've developed to try and help senior managers understand this is called the Change Kaleidoscope. The Change Kaleidoscope has two parts to it. Around the outer ring, there are 8 features that we ask senior managers to consider in turn and in depth. The central ring gives them a series of design choices, a series of questions that enable them to think about the design of change. But we only get them to look at that central ring when they've actually worked their way round these 8 features in the outer ring. And over the next few minutes, I'm going to concentrate on explaining those 8 features and why they're so important to successful change implementation. So first of all, we'll look at a summary of those contextual features, and then I'm going to go through each of them in more depth. The first 4, time, how quickly the change is needed; scope, what degree of change is needed; preservation, what does this organisation actually need to maintain? What resources and characteristics are actually very important? And diversity, the level of homogeneity within the organisation or the level of diversity within the organisation. The next 4 features are capability, capacity, readiness, and power. Capability is the organisation's capability to implement change. Capacity, slightly different, is the level of resources that the organisation can deploy to make this change happen. Readiness is how ready, how receptive is this workforce for change. And lastly, power. What power does the change leader have to actually impose this change, to make this change happen? And we're going to look at those in more depth over the next few slides. The first thing that we're going to look at is the issue of time. And one of the things to ask is this a crisis? Is this something that we need to deliver very, very quickly in order to maintain competitive advantage? Or in fact, is this change something that is going to be rolled out and implemented over a very long period of time? Now, whatever the answer is to that question has huge implications for how you actually design the change. So, for instance, if you've got a very short period of time in which to deliver the change, then you're probably going to have to be fairly directive in the way you set about communicating this change. And it may be that you can't be that consultative or participative because there simply isn't the time. Alternatively, if you actually find that you've got quite a long period of time with which to effect this change, you may well find that your design options open up for you, that you can actually employ quite participative and consultative ways of implementing this change. You may be able to do it in a much more bottom-up way. But the key thing is, what is the need within the organisation at the moment? As I go through the next few features, the important thing to think about is what is driving this, the needs of the organisation or my particular preference. And at all times, it should be what the organisation needs, not what the particular preference is of the change leader. The next feature that we get senior managers to consider is the idea of scope. And scope has two facets or two levels. One is we ask senior managers to think, how broad is this change? How much of the organisation is actually going to need to be affected by this change programme? So, for instance, if you're in an international organisation, does every national division need to be involved in this change programme? Or in fact, could you focus on one or two national units? Are they the primary targets for this change? On a national basis or in a public sector organisation, you might say, well, actually, do all the functions, do all the different departments need to be involved? Is this something that's actually vital for the operations or the production department, but actually it's not critical for the marketing department? So those are the sort of questions that you have to ask yourself about breadth. The second level is the idea of depth. And here we're asking senior managers to think, how deep is this change? How fundamental is this change? How much are we really trying to transform the organisation? If you're actually trying to go for a cultural change where you're really trying to change the mindset, the behaviours and the attitudes of the organisation, that's what we would call a very deep change. And if that's what you're trying to achieve, then drawing down from that, this is going to take you a considerable length of time. It's also probably going to mean, if you're going to try and change people's behaviours and attitudes, you're probably going to have to do it in at least a participative and consultative way, because people won't change their behaviours and attitudes just by being directed to do so. So again, you can start to see how the answers to this one set of questions around scope start to help you hone down the options for design. They start to help you think what is possible in terms of the way you design this change. The third feature we get senior managers to think about is one that's really quite unusual in change management. Very often in change theory and change literature, there's an emphasis on actually what needs to be destroyed, what needs to be changed. Here, we're asking first senior managers to really think about, what do we need to preserve? What are some of our competences or resources or characteristics that are very, very important to this organisation, that actually deliver significant competitive advantage to us? Now, these may be quite tangible, but some of them might be intangible. Intangible ones include things like organisational culture, the brand of the organisation, perhaps the levels of loyalty or trust that exist within the organisation. So you need to think about all these intangible resources, And then you need to say, to what extent are these actually really important sources of competitive advantage? If you can identify some of these resources or competences, and they are important, then one of the things you've got to think about is, how do I design and roll out that change in such a way that we are able to preserve these very, very good sources of competitive advantage, rather than inadvertently destroying them in the process of implementing change? At the same time, when you're considering this question, you do also have to think about, well, are there some things we actually need to destroy or eradicate? Perhaps there are old working practices that were originally put in place for a very, very good reason, but actually have become anachronistic, not so useful, not so critical to the organization's performance. And maybe there are some of those activities, routines, practices, or even perhaps functions or departments that actually need to be eradicated or closed down. And so you do think about what needs to be destroyed as well as what needs to be preserved under this feature. Fourth feature we get people to look at is diversity. And here I really want to stress that we are not talking about diversity in the equal opportunity sense. Here we're talking about diversity in a much more generic sense. How uniform is this organisation in terms of culture or staff groupings? Or how diverse is it? Now, there are lots and lots of sources of diversity. Obviously, some of the demographic ones are things like gender or age group, lengths of tenure, nationality, etc., etc. But there are other sources of diversity. So, how many different divisions or departments are there in an organization? If it's international, how many different geographic divisions are there? So, you really need to map the level of diversity within any one organization. And having mapped it in terms of these different groupings, what you have to think about then is, who are staff loyal to? Are they loyal to the organisation as a whole? So, for instance, if you're working for GlaxoSmithKline, do you feel a loyalty for GlaxoSmithKline as a global corporation? Or do you feel a loyalty for GlaxoSmithKline within the UK or within Germany? Or in fact, if you're an R&D scientist, a research and development scientist within GlaxoSmithKline, do you feel a loyalty perhaps to the research and development community within GlaxoSmithKline? So who do people identify with from those different groupings? Now, one of the reasons we ask this question is that it's very, very important to know who people feel loyal to, because it's those people who will be able to lead them through change. So, for instance, if in fact you're a research and development scientist and the people that you really identify with are other research and development scientists within your division, then it's going to be those people who can actually persuade you to perhaps change your routines, your behaviors, your attitudes. And that's why this diversity piece is very important. In addition, once you've actually identified who people are loyal to, who they feel are their leaders, the other thing you might want to consider is you might want to use different strokes for different folks. So you might want to implement different styles of change programs depending on whether you're dealing with scientists or sales and marketing people or production people. Very often the sort of things that will motivate an R&D scientist to change might be very different from the things that motivate a salesperson to change. And it might mean that whilst your end goal is the same within the company, you might have different change programs running in different departments and different divisions in order to persuade people with different programs and different campaigns. So diversity is quite a big feature to consider. The fifth feature is one where we ask senior managers to seriously consider the levels of change capability within the organisation. Now, I want to stress that here we're talking about the competence of the organisation to manage change. So we're not talking about the competence of GlaxoSmithKline as a pharmaceutical company, its ability to produce or sell drugs. We're not talking about, for instance, GKN's ability as an engineering group to manufacture for the aerospace industry. No, here we're talking about the ability of an organization to implement change. And when you're considering and measuring your organization's capability in this area, it's very useful to think about it on 3 separate levels. First level is the level of the individual. So if you look at individuals within the organization, how capable are your senior managers, for instance, at managing change within their own personal lives? Are they actually capable of being change resilient and change competent themselves at a very personal level? That's a very, very important thing to consider, because if your senior people are not change competent as individual leaders, they may have problems leading others through change. But another thing to consider at the level of the individual is, do lower levels understand the process of personal transition? Do they understand that in the process of personal transition, it's quite normal to feel resistant to the change, to feel gloomy and negative about change at certain points? And that is quite a normal stage that everyone goes through before accepting the need to change and actually starting to implement change. This level of understanding about individual transition is important at both senior and lower levels. The second level to consider in this feature is the level of managerial capability to implement change. In particular, here we encourage senior managers to really assess the competence of their line managers to coach and counsel people through change. Now, you can measure this through attitude survey results, you can measure this through focus groups. But again, one of the important things is you have to know how competent your managerial cadre is at helping people through change before you design it. So, for instance, if you design a change program that is based around very participative ways of communicating and counseling people through change, and your main coaches and counselors are your line managers, and they're actually useless at coaching and counseling, it's highly likely that change program is going to actually fail. So again, before designing the change program, you've got to think about your levels of competence in the area of change management. Now, sometimes if it's lacking in this area, what some organizations will do is before they roll the change out, they will actually increase the level of capability at this level of managerial capability. What they'll do is they might send line managers on 1 or 2 day change management courses to help them become more adept at counselling and coaching people through change. Or alternatively, they might bring external consultants or coaches in to actually help people through the change. The key thing is to assess this area before you start off. The third area is the organisational level, the level of organisational development, the level of competence in an organisation for actually understanding significant organisational change. Now, this can be in an organisational development unit or department. It can be vested in a change management unit. It can be contained within the senior management team itself. But the key thing is, have you got people within the organisation who have both experience and knowledge of significant organisational change, such as merger, acquisition, cultural change, restructuring, downsizing, privatisation, an experience and an expertise in this area of fundamental change? And again, you need to know that before you set off designing the change. And again, you might want to actually increase your levels of capability before you start the change program. The next feature is related to capability, but whereas capability measures competence or skills or experience and knowledge, capacity as a feature asks senior managers to think about the actual physical resources they can deploy to help people through change. And the three physical resources we've identified as very critical here are cash, the actual money that you can invest in making change happen, the time. Can you create extra time in managers' days so that they have more time to actually manage change? We find in a lot of organizations that we research that managers are expected to implement change sometime between midnight and 6 o'clock. They're given no extra time in the day job. They're not relieved of any additional activities. No space is created within their normal day to actually allow them to give attention to change. So change becomes an extra. Change becomes something that you do on top of the day job. And it's very difficult to build up momentum and energy when no time is created for managers to actually attend to change. The third area to think about is, are there people that you can take out of their normal jobs to actually create as change champions or special change leaders in departments or teams? Is there an extra amount of human resource that can be devoted to aiding and assisting the organization in this change? Now, again, a critical feature to consider, because you don't want to design a change program that is actually hugely costly in either time or people or money, only to find that those three resources are lacking once you've rolled it out. That would be a foolish decision. And again, it affects your design then fundamentally, these three areas of resource. The penultimate feature that we get senior managers to look at is one that I feel very strongly about. I feel strongly about this because I believe that most senior managers do not assess this feature at all well before they implement change. And this is the feature that we call readiness for change. And this is talking about the level of receptivity for change within the broad workforce, managers and employees alike. Now, this exists on two levels. One is the rational awareness of the need to implement change. So the intellectual awareness of why change is necessary. So do I understand why we're going into this merger? Do I understand why we're going into this, why we're being privatized perhaps? Do I understand why this restructuring is necessary? And this is a rational awareness of why change needs to happen. And this is a necessary but insufficient condition for many changes, because the second level of awareness that you want is a commitment at a very personal level to actually make that change. Now, it's difficult sometimes for people to really understand the difference between the two. And what you'll find in organisations is that when we interview people about change, they'll say, yeah, no, I understand why this is necessary. I understand the business strategy. I understand why we're merging, or I understand why we're closing down this plant in business strategy terms. But do I feel committed to that change is a different question. Do I feel committed and engaged by that change proposition? Maybe not. Maybe I can understand why it's happening in business terms, but I may not be prepared to make the commitment at an emotional level to actually change my behaviours or my attitudes or the way I do my job or the location of my job. And so it's very, very important to assess this feature before you start to implement change. Now, again, lots of ways that you can do this. Attitude survey results are a very, very good source of information for senior managers on this. Focus groups, etc., etc. Anything that allows managers to, if you like, take the temperature of the employees. And in order to really assess readiness, you've got to have a senior team that are good at listening to what we would call the voice of the employees, and not be afraid of hearing perhaps negative comment on the necessity or the readiness for change. Now, again, once you've got the reading on this feature, once you've got the data in about this, you have to make some decisions. So if you've got a very low readiness for change within the workforce or within part of the workforce, one of the things you might have to think about is, before rolling out this change into that particular group or division, you might have to do a large amount of communication activity to actually raise levels of awareness and commitment within that particular group or division. And so again, you can see how the analysis that you do on these features really starts to affect how you design the implementation of change. The last feature that we encourage senior managers to consider is one that is very important, and this one is, of course, the nutty problem of power. And here we encourage people to look at the issue of stakeholders. How many different stakeholder groups are there than within the organisation who can either make or break this change? Now, stakeholders can exist within the organisation and outside the organisation as well. Inside the organisation, it might be trade union groups, particular employee groups, levels of organisations, a particular division or a department. And outside the organisation, again, it's worth considering the attitudes of government, pressure groups, of the customers themselves. When the retail banks in the 1990s started to change their business model, which involved closure of large amounts of branches on the high streets, the customers of these banks became a pressure group in their own right, saying, no, you will not close down these branches. We want access to our bank on a local and accessible basis. So mapping out the stakeholders and the power and the attitudes towards the change before you roll the change out, again, is very important. And the second thing is to think about the power and autonomy of the change agent. So how powerful is the person that's been charged with the leadership of this change? How much of autonomy have they got to actually manage this change, to make this change happen? Do they have to work in a hugely consultative way with a variety of different other power groups? Or, in fact, if they have a large amount of power, can they be quite directive in the way that they actually implement the change? So that, again, is a very important feature to look at before you roll out the change. Now, what we see in this next slide is that when you've done all of this analysis, you want to get the senior team to actually look at this as a whole. And here we've got an example of an analysis of a change situation in the pharmaceutical company Glaxo. This is before Glaxo became part of GlaxoSmithKline. So it's a change scenario back in the 1990s. Now, as you can see, what you can do with this model, the change kaleidoscope, is to actually map which of these features is against the change, which of the features are actually for the change, and which, well, we've analysed them, we've found out the data, but they're actually neutral. They're not actually critical for this change. They're not change critical, as we would say. If I just point out a few features here to help you see how this model actually works, you can see that one of the key things that Glaxo wanted to do was preserve the workforce that they had. In the 1990s, Glaxo had an extremely good sales force, probably the best in the industry. They had very good research and development scientists. They were facing competitive threats because the patent on their blockbuster drug Zantac was due to expire in about 1997. And so whilst they needed to change, at the same time, they didn't particularly want to lose their excellent workforce. They wanted to keep people, they wanted to retain their talent within the organisation. They saw them as an important and inimitable asset. And that meant that the way they set about trying to implement this organisational change was in a hugely participative and consultative way with the workforce. They would attempt to take the workforce with them and consult with them at all times to keep their motivation and to keep them staying in employment with them. The other area that was very critical for them, as you can see, was the level of readiness for change. Now, funnily enough, one of the reasons the level of readiness for change in Glaxo at this time was quite low was because they were actually very, very successful. They had this blockbuster drug called Zantac. It was a hugely successful, best-selling drug around the world, and it gave them huge competitive advantage. And they were recording very, very good business results. Now, the consequence of that was that actually they had quite a complacent workforce. The workforce saw the business results, they enjoyed good bonuses, they thought the company was excellent, they trusted their senior managers, all of which are fantastically good things in the short term. But it meant that actually they couldn't see why change was necessary in the longer term. And this meant overall that they had very low readiness for change. Now, the other features in this kaleidoscope, as you can see, were quite positive. They had quite high potential for capability for change because they had a highly educated and loyal workforce. Their capacity was good. They had quite a lot of cash they could invest in this. And because it was a long-term change, they had quite a long period of time before this patent expired, time was on their side. So there were some positive features, but one of the things that Glaxo actually chose to do was to phase this change, and in particular, in the first phase of change, try and address this issue of readiness for change. So one of the things they did was, for the first year, 12 to 18 months, they actually invested in a huge communication campaign to raise levels of awareness within the workforce about why change was necessary, even though they were enjoying very good business success in the immediate short term. And the way that they set about designing these communication activities became a change program in itself. And on the next slide, we'll go on and see how they actually set about designing these communication activities. Here we can see almost the second part of this model, which senior managers then go on to look at, which is this idea of, okay, how are we going to actually set about managing this change? And we can see that in the first phase of change, Glaxo set about doing this in a fairly top-down way. They had to actually implement these communication activities in a top-down way. Why? Because there was low readiness for change. Nothing was going to happen bottom up because nobody was aware of why this change was necessary. So in the first instance, they had to do things in a fairly top-down way. They did it in a participative way. Why? Because they wanted to take the workforce with them. If they'd been too directive or too coercive in the way they'd gone about change, then they ran the risk of this very talented workforce actually walking out the door and going to work for the competition. So they did it in a very participative way to maintain goodwill of their employees. They focused in particular on behaviours. They set about prescribing a quite specific set of behaviours that were to be adopted by the workforce as a way of addressing the new competitive threat. And the interventions that they used was an awful lot of attention on management development. They changed an awful lot of human resource systems. They changed the performance management system. They changed the reward systems. And they made quite a lot of symbolic changes. They actually moved offices at this time and used the design of the new offices to reflect the culture that they were trying to move to. And critical in all of this were the senior team, who were excellent leaders and were hugely facilitative in taking the workforce with them in a very, very participative manner. This meant that at the end of the first phase of change for Glaxo, the kaleidoscope analysis at the end of the first phase looked much more positive, as we'll go on to see in the next slide. So in the next slide, as you can see, by the second phase of change, they had actually increased the levels of readiness for change, and what they were left with as a barrier now in the second phase of change was the scope, that they still had quite a significant transformation to do. But they had reshaped this context so that it was more receptive to change overall than it had been at the beginning of the process. And this is one of the very important features of this model, is that it not only allows you to analyse the context, but it allows senior teams to think about, well, okay, if that's the context we're starting with, is there a way that we can reshape this context so that we make the organisation more receptive to change. And this is what you can see that Glaxo did through this phased approach to change. And one of the things I'll leave you thinking about is that some of the students and senior managers who have worked with this model over the years have likened the model of the kaleidoscope to a dashboard, or a dashboard in a car, or the set of instruments that an airline pilot might have in the cockpit of a plane. And it's really a model that allows you to assess the fitness of the plane or the fitness of the organisation to make the change journey that's being proposed. And whilst nobody would expect a pilot to start to take a plane to 38,000 feet without checking whether or not you've got sufficient fuel, or the state of the wheels, or the haulage devices, or the oxygen available for the cabin. In the same way, this model is suggesting that senior managers should really apply the same level of due diligence to assessing how fit the organisation is to undertake this change, and then designing a change programme that takes into account the organisational context as they find it. And that's why this model has proved so useful to practitioners around the world.